The Orphan train wheezed to a halt at Maynard station with a grinding of brakes that seemed to echo the collective sigh of exhaustion from its young passengers. Steam hissed from the engine as townspeople gathered along the wooden platform, their faces a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Children pressed against the train windows, some eager, others shrinking back into the shadows of their seats. Emma Henley stood apart from the crowd, her weathered hands clasped before her brown wool dress. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd learned to find strength in solitude. The March wind tugged at her dark hair, pulled back in a simple bun that had come slightly loose during her hurried walk from the general store. She hadn't planned to attend the selection, but something had drawn her feet toward the station despite her better judgment. The train conductor, a man with silver whiskers and kind eyes, stepped down and consulted his pocket watch. "Ladies and gentlemen of Maynard, we've got 23 children aboard today, ages 5 to 16. Good Christian boys and girls from New York, looking for families to take them in and give them a proper start in life." Emma's gaze swept the faces gathering around the platform. She recognized most of them. The Washingtons who ran the hotel, the Clancys with their sprawling farm, Doc Morrison and his wife who'd been trying for children near on 15 years. All good people, she reminded herself, though she knew some had come looking for hands to work rather than children to love. The first group of children descended from the train, shepherded by a stern-faced matron in a navy traveling dress. They arranged themselves in a careful line along the platform, hands clasped, eyes downcast. Emma's heart clenched at the sight of their worn shoes and patched clothing, the way they held themselves as if bracing for disappointment. "Step forward and introduce yourselves," the matron instructed with brisk efficiency. "Remember what we practiced." One by one, the children spoke their names and ages, some barely above a whisper. Emma found herself studying their faces, wondering what sorrows had brought them so far from home. The Washingtons approached a sturdy boy of 12 who'd given his name as Thomas. The Clancys examined a pair of brothers, debating their potential for farm work in voices not quite low enough. "What about that one?" Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop pointed toward the train car. "There's still a girl inside." Emma followed her gaze to see a slight figure pressed against the window. The child appeared to be around 10 or 11, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She made no move to join the others on the platform. The matron's mouth tightened. "Lucy Morrison. She's been difficult. Won't come out, won't speak to prospective families. Been like this since Chicago. Stubborn, is she?" Doc Morrison stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Sometimes children need a gentle approach. May I?" He climbed the train steps with careful movements, his voice carrying softly through the open door. "Hello there, miss. I'm Dr. Morrison. I understand you might not be feeling well." No response came from within the car. Emma found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. The child's face in the window reminded her of herself at that age. Wary, protective, old beyond her years. She'd grown up in her father's house after her mother's death, learning early that the world could be harsh to those without protection. "Lucy," the matron called from the platform, her tone growing sharper. "You will come out this instant. These good people don't have all day." Still no movement from the girl. Doc Morrison emerged from the train, shaking his head. "She won't speak. Just sits there staring. Might be simple, or just scared out of her wits." "She ain't simple," a voice piped up from the line of children. A boy of perhaps 13 with serious dark eyes stepped forward slightly. "She's just careful. Lucy's the one who stopped Jimmy from eating them berries that would have made him sick. She knows things." The matron's face flushed. "Daniel, return to your place immediately." But Emma had heard enough. Without fully understanding why, she found herself approaching the train. The other adults parted to let her pass, some with curious glances, others with the resigned patience of neighbors who'd learned not to question Emma Henley's occasional odd impulses. She paused at the bottom of the steps, looking up toward where the girl sat. Lucy. That's a pretty name. I'm Emma. I live on a homestead about 3 miles from town. Got a big garden that needs tending, and a milk cow named Bessie who's partial to children who'll scratch behind her ears. The face in the window shifted slightly, though the girl didn't move from her seat. I ain't looking for a worker, Emma continued, her voice carrying the honest cadence of someone who'd never learned to lie well. Got no husband to impress, no family to please. Just me and Bessie and a house that gets mighty quiet come evening. If you're of a mind to stay put on that train, that's your right. But if you're wanting a place where nobody's gonna force you to smile when you don't feel like smiling, you might find my place suits you. The silence stretched long enough that Emma began to feel foolish. She was turning to leave when she heard the soft sound of movement from within the car. The girl appeared at the top of the steps, clutching a small cloth bundle that appeared to contain all her worldly possessions. Lucy Morrison was smaller than Emma had expected, with the pale complexion of someone who'd spent too much time indoors and not enough time with proper meals. Her dress was clean but worn thin in places, and her shoes had been resoled at least once. But it was her eyes that caught Emma's attention. Intelligent, watchful eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her surroundings. The girl said nothing, simply stood at the top of the steps as if waiting for something. You don't have to decide right now, Emma said gently. But if you're willing, you could come see the place. If it don't suit you, Doc Morrison here will see you back to the station safe and sound. He's a good man, and his words as solid as bedrock. Doc Morrison nodded gravely. That's a promise, young lady. Mrs. Henley's place is a fine homestead, and she's got the respect of everyone in this town. But you've got choices, and nobody's gonna force you into anything. For the first time, Lucy's gaze met Emma's directly. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the wordless communication of two souls who'd learned to be cautious with their trust. The girl descended the steps slowly, her bundle clutched tightly against her chest. When she reached the platform, she positioned herself near Emma but not quite beside her, maintaining the careful distance of someone prepared to run if necessary. The matron approached with her ledger, relief evident on her face. Mrs. Henley, you'll need to sign here and here. The terms are standard: proper clothing, education, religious instruction. The child is to be treated as family, not as hired help. I understand. Emma accepted the pen and signed with careful strokes. What about schooling? We got a teacher comes through twice a month. Lucy can read and write well above her age, the matron replied, consulting her notes. Mathematics too. She's gifted in that regard. Been helping the younger children with their letters. Emma glanced down at Lucy, who was studying the ground with intense concentration. That's so. Well, I got a whole shelf of books that ain't been opened in far too long. Maybe you could help me remember what they say. The faintest hint of interest flickered across the girl's face before she composed herself again. The crowd was beginning to disperse as other families completed their selections. Emma noticed Daniel, the boy who'd spoken up for Lucy, being approached by the Clancys. His shoulders squared with resignation as he followed them toward their wagon. You got friends on that train? Emma asked Lucy quietly. The girl's eyes followed Daniel's retreating figure, and she nodded once. Clancys are good people. Work hard, expect the same from others, but they ain't cruel. Daniel will be well fed and safe. Sometimes that's the most any of us can hope for. Lucy's grip on her bundle loosened slightly. Emma's own wagon waited at the edge of the station yard, a sturdy farm wagon pulled by a gentle mare named Daisy. She'd hitched up that morning to collect supplies from town, never imagining she'd be bringing home a child. That's Daisy, Emma said as they approached. She's got opinions about most things, but she's reliable. Been with me near on 5 years now. Lucy examined the horse with the same careful attention she'd given everything else. When Daisy lowered her head to investigate the newcomer, Lucy remained perfectly still, letting the mare catch her scent. She likes you, Emma observed. Daisy's usually more standoffish with strangers. They climbed onto the wagon seat, Lucy perching on the edge as if ready to jump down at any moment. Emma clicked her tongue and Daisy began the familiar journey home, wagon wheels crunching over the dirt road that led out of Maynard. The countryside rolled past them in the gentle rhythm of early spring, fields showing the first green hints of new growth, trees beginning to bud, the whole world awakening from winter's long sleep. Emma found herself seeing it through Lucy's eyes, wondering what the child made of the vast open spaces after whatever cramped conditions she'd known in New York. "That's the Peterson farm," Emma said as they passed a neat homestead with smoke rising from the chimney. "They got 3 boys, all grown now and working their own places. Mrs. Peterson makes the finest apple preserves this side of Kansas City." Lucy nodded but said nothing. "And that there's where the creek runs closest to the road. Come summer, it's a good spot for washing clothes or just cooling your feet after a long day. Water runs clear and cold even in the worst heat." They crested a small hill, and Emma's homestead came into view. It wasn't much to look at, a simple 2-story frame house with a wide front porch, a barn that needed new paint, a chicken coop, and the garden plot that would soon need preparing for spring planting. But it was neat and well maintained, surrounded by the kind of mature trees that spoke of permanence. "There she is," Emma said simply. "Home." Lucy's eyes took in every detail. The smoke rising from the chimney, the cow grazing in the pasture, the clothesline where Emma's washing fluttered in the breeze. For the first time since leaving the train, the girl's expression softened slightly. Daisy pulled up to the front porch without guidance, knowing the routine. Emma climbed down and waited to see if Lucy would follow. The girl sat on the wagon seat for a long moment, clutching her bundle, before carefully making her way to the ground. "Bessie's in the barn," Emma said, pointing toward the structure. "She's probably wondering where I got to. Cows don't much like changes in routine." They walked toward the barn together, Emma maintaining the same careful distance Lucy seemed to prefer. The building was dim and warm, filled with the comfortable smells of hay and animals. Bessie looked up from her stall with the mild interest of a creature whose main concerns centered around food and comfort. "This is Bessie," Emma said unnecessarily. "She's got strong opinions about most things, but she's partial to anyone who brings her a handful of oats." Lucy approached the stall with the same cautious movements she'd shown with Daisy. Bessie lowered her great head, allowing the child to touch her nose. When Lucy's small hand made contact, the cow's eyes closed in contentment. "She likes you too," Emma observed. "Animals got good instincts about people. Better than most humans, truth be told." They returned to the house as the afternoon sun began to slant lower through the trees. The front door opened into a parlor that was simple but comfortable. Handmade furniture, a braided rug, books lining one wall, and a fireplace that currently held the remains of the morning's fire. "Your room's upstairs," Emma said, leading the way up a narrow staircase. "Used to be mine when I was younger, before Pa added the room downstairs for me." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered by a wedding ring quilt, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the garden plot toward the distant hills. Someone, Emma, clearly, had placed a few wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill. Lucy set her bundle on the bed and walked to the window. The view stretched for miles, open country broken only by scattered homesteads and the winding line of trees that marked the creek's path. "It's different from the city, I expect," Emma said. "Quieter. Some folks find it lonesome, but I've always found peace in it. Room to think, room to breathe." Lucy turned from the window and looked directly at Emma for the second time. Her mouth opened as if she might speak, then closed again. "No rush," Emma said gently. "Words come when they're ready. You hungry? Got beef stew simmering, and bread I baked this morning." They went back downstairs to the kitchen, where Emma busied herself ladling stew into bowls and slicing thick pieces of bread. The simple domestic rituals seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Lucy sat at the table, the same table where Emma had eaten every meal for the past 15 years, and accepted her portion with a small nod. The stew was rich and hearty, full of vegetables from Emma's root cellar and beef from a steer she'd traded with the Petersons the previous fall. Lucy ate with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste food, but Emma was pleased to see her finish the entire bowl. "More?" Emma asked. Lucy shook her head but smiled, the first real smile Emma had seen from her. As the evening shadows lengthened, Emma lit the oil lamps and settled into her chair by the fireplace with a piece of mending. Lucy remained at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, watching the play of firelight on the walls. "There's books on that shelf there," Emma said without looking up from her sewing. "Help yourself to any that catch your fancy. Or there's paper and pencil in the kitchen drawer if you've a mind to write." Lucy rose and examined the bookshelf with the thoroughness she brought to everything else. Most of the volumes were practical, farming guides, medical texts, a few novels her father had collected over the years. She selected a slim volume of poetry and returned to her chair. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the homestead. Outside, the familiar sounds of evening began. Cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through new leaves, the call of a night bird. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the oil lamp cast a warm circle of light over Emma's mending and Lucy's book. When the mantel clock chimed 9, Emma set aside her work. "Time for bed, I expect. Morning comes early on a farm, and there's always work to be done." Lucy closed the book carefully and stood. At the foot of the stairs, she paused and looked back at Emma. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice was soft but clear, with the precise diction of someone who'd been well taught. "You're welcome," Emma replied. "Sleep well, child. Tomorrow we'll show you around proper, introduce you to the chickens and see about getting you some clothes that fit better." Lucy nodded and climbed the stairs. Emma heard her moving around in the room above. Careful, quiet movements as she prepared for sleep in a strange place. Emma banked the fire and checked that the doors were secured before making her own way to bed. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of her home settling for the night, she found herself thinking about the child upstairs. There were mysteries there, secrets that would take time and patience to uncover. But she'd seen something in Lucy's eyes that spoke to her own lonely heart, a recognition of kindred spirits finding each other in an uncertain world. Outside, the March wind continued to blow, carrying with it the promise of spring and the hope of new beginnings. Emma Henley closed her eyes and slept more peacefully than she had in months, knowing she was no longer alone in her quiet homestead. Upstairs, Lucy Morrison lay awake longer, staring out the window at stars brighter than any she'd ever seen through the smoky air of the city, wondering if she'd finally found a place where she might belong. The rooster's crow pulled Emma from sleep before dawn, as it had every morning for the past 15 years. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person moving about upstairs. Lucy had been with her for 3 weeks now, and while the child had settled into the routines of homestead life with remarkable adaptability, she remained largely silent, speaking only when directly asked a question, and even then with careful economy of words. Emma dressed quickly in her work clothes and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Lucy already seated at the table, fully dressed and waiting with the patient stillness that seemed to be her natural state. The child had taken to rising early, perhaps from years of institutional schedules, and Emma had learned to set out clothes the night before so Lucy wouldn't have to fumble in the darkness. "Morning," Emma said softly, not wanting to startle her. Lucy nodded in response, her eyes tracking Emma's movements as she built up the fire in the stove and set the coffee pot to boil. The morning routine had developed naturally over their first week together. Emma would prepare breakfast while Lucy sat quietly, then they would eat together before beginning the day's work. It was a comfortable arrangement, though Emma found herself hoping that someday the silence might ease into actual conversation. Outside, spring was asserting itself with increasing confidence. The apple trees behind the house were showing the first hints of blossoms, and the garden plot that had seemed so barren just weeks before was now marked with neat rows of green shoots where Emma had planted peas and early lettuces. The creek that ran through the back of her property was running high with snow melt from the distant mountains, creating a cheerful babbling that carried through the morning air. Cardinals had returned to nest in the oak tree near the kitchen window, their bright red flashes adding color to the awakening landscape. Today would be warm enough to work without heavy coats, and Emma had plans to show Lucy how to tend the seedlings they'd started in the kitchen window. The tomato plants had grown leggy in their small pots, reaching desperately toward the weak winter light that had filtered through the glass. Now they needed the freedom of open soil and room to spread their roots. "Thought we might work in the garden today," Emma said as she served eggs and bacon onto Lucy's plate. The eggs came from her own chickens, and the bacon from a pig she'd traded with the Johnsons the previous fall. Everything on their table was the product of careful planning and hard work, part of the endless cycle of preparation and preservation that kept a homestead running through the seasons. "Time to transplant those tomato seedlings we've been nursing along. You got gentle hands for that kind of work." It was true. Emma had discovered that Lucy possessed an almost uncanny ability with growing things. Seed seemed to sprout faster under her care, and the sickly seedling that Emma had nearly given up on had flourished once Lucy began tending it. The child had a way of knowing exactly how much water each plant needed, when to move them into better light, when to pinch back growth to encourage stronger roots. She would sit beside the kitchen window for long stretches, her small fingers carefully turning pots to ensure even growth, or gently brushing dust from leaves with a tenderness that spoke of deep understanding. Lucy nodded and ate her breakfast with her usual careful attention to not wasting a single bite. Emma had tried increasing the portions, suspecting the child was still hungry, but Lucy would simply eat more slowly, making the food last exactly as long as it needed to. It was another reminder of the careful self-control that seemed to govern everything Lucy did, the hard-learned habits of someone who'd never been certain when the next meal might come. After breakfast, they made their way to the garden. The morning air was crisp but promising, with the kind of golden sunlight that spoke of warmer days ahead. Bessie lowed from her pasture, a sound of contentment as she grazed on new grass that was finally tall enough to be worth her attention. The chickens scratched and pecked in their yard, creating the peaceful soundtrack of a farm waking up to another day of productive work. Emma had let them out of their coop at first light, and they were now engaged in their eternal quest for bugs and seeds, their soft clucking a comfortable backdrop to the morning's tasks. Emma had prepared the garden bed the day before, working compost into the rich dark soil that her father had spent years building up. The earth was dark and crumbly, rich with the decomposed remains of last year's kitchen scraps and barn waste, mixed with leaves that had been raked and composted through the winter months. Now it lay ready for planting, neat furrows waiting for seeds and transplants. She handed Lucy a small trowel and showed her how to dig holes for the tomato seedlings, spacing them properly and creating small wells to hold water. "Plants are like people," Emma said as she worked alongside Lucy, her hands dark with soil. The earth felt good between her fingers, cold but alive with the promise of growth. "Give them good ground to grow in, plenty of water and sunshine, and most of them will flourish. But some need extra patience. Some have been through hard times and take longer to trust that good conditions will last." Lucy paused in her digging and looked up at Emma with those watchful eyes. For a moment, Emma thought she might respond, but instead the child simply nodded and returned to her work with even greater care. Her small hands cupped each seedling as she transferred it from pot to ground, protecting the delicate roots from the cool air. They worked steadily through the morning, transplanting tomatoes, peppers, and the bean seedlings that would climb poles Emma had cut from the woodlot behind the barn. The poles were straight saplings she'd selected and trimmed during the winter months, now weathered and ready to support the climbing plants that would provide fresh vegetables through the summer and dried beans for winter storage. Lucy proved to have an intuitive understanding of the work, her small hands gentle but efficient as she settled each plant into its new home and patted soil carefully around the roots. The sun climbed higher as they worked, and Emma found herself stealing glances at Lucy as the child absorbed herself completely in the task. There was something almost reverent in the way Lucy handled each plant, as if she understood the faith required to put a small green thing into the ground and trust it to grow. Perhaps, Emma thought, children who'd been uprooted themselves understood the precious nature of finding good soil and careful tending. When the church bell in town rang 11 o'clock, carried on the morning breeze across the miles of open prairie, Emma straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. "Time for a break," she declared. "All this bending is reminding me I ain't 20 anymore." They sat on the front porch steps, sharing a jar of cool water drawn from the well that morning and watching Daisy crop grass in the pasture. The mare had wintered well, her coat now sleek and shining as she shed the last of her thick winter hair. The morning's work had left them both pleasantly tired, and Emma felt the familiar satisfaction of progress made, of the eternal cycle of planting and tending that marked the seasons of a farming life. From their position on the porch, Emma could see most of her small domain: the barn where Bessie was now resting in whatever shade she could find, the chicken coop where a few hens had returned to lay their afternoon eggs, the garden with its neat rows of newly transplanted seedlings, and beyond it all the rolling prairie that stretched to the horizon. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was hers, earned through years of careful work and prudent management. "Mrs. Henley?" Lucy's voice was so quiet that Emma almost missed it over the sound of wind rustling through the new leaves of the oak tree. "Yes, child. The boy on the train. Daniel. Is he well?" Emma felt a flutter of hope at the longest sentence Lucy had spoken since her arrival. The child's voice carried a note of genuine concern, and Emma realized this was the first time Lucy had voluntarily brought up her past or expressed worry about someone else's welfare. "Far as I know. Haven't heard otherwise from the Clancys, and bad news travels fast in a place like this." Emma kept her voice casual, not wanting to overwhelm Lucy with too much enthusiasm about her speaking up. "Would you like to visit? See how he's settling in?" Lucy nodded eagerly, the first show of real enthusiasm Emma had seen from her. Her eyes brightened, and she leaned forward slightly, as if the prospect of seeing her friend again had awakened something that had been carefully held in check. "We could drive over this afternoon," Emma said. "It's only about 5 miles to their place. Give us a chance to see how our neighbors are faring, and you can satisfy yourself that Daniel's doing well. The Clancys are good people, worked hard to build up their farm, and they've got a reputation for treating folks fair." The rest of the morning passed more quickly, with Lucy showing increased energy in her work. Emma noticed the child humming softly as she weeded around the lettuce plants. Not a tune Emma recognized, but something gentle and rhythmic that seemed to help Lucy's hands find their rhythm. The melody was sweet and simple, perhaps something she'd learned in the orphanage or remembered from before her circumstances changed so drastically. They finished the transplanting and moved on to other garden tasks, checking the progress of the early peas, which were already sending out delicate tendrils seeking something to climb, and examining the potato bed where green shoots were just beginning to emerge from the earth. Emma showed Lucy how to hill the potatoes, mounding soil around the growing plants to encourage more tuber development and protect them from late frost. "Potatoes are forgiving," Emma explained as they worked with their hoes. "Plant them right, tend them proper, and they'll feed you through the winter. My pa always said potatoes were the backbone of frontier survival. Fills you up, keeps well in the root cellar, and you can do 100 different things with them when other food runs short." Lucy absorbed this information with the same careful attention she gave everything, filing it away with all the other practical knowledge Emma had been sharing. The child seemed hungry for understanding how things worked, why certain tasks were done at particular times, what the connections were between present actions and future survival. After a dinner of leftover stew and fresh bread, they hitched Daisy to the wagon and set off for the Clancy farm. Emma had changed into her better dress, a deep blue calico that she reserved for social calls, and Lucy wore the new dress Emma had sewn for her from fabric purchased during their last trip to town. The dress was simple but well made, in a cheerful yellow that brought out the golden highlights in Lucy's auburn hair. The road wound through countryside that was coming alive with spring growth, wild flowers dotting the meadows in splashes of purple and white, trees showing the fresh green of new leaves, and everywhere the sense of renewal that made this Emma's favorite season. They passed other homesteads, some prosperous and well-maintained, others showing the struggle of families trying to carve a living from stubborn land. Emma pointed out landmarks and shared bits of local history, helping Lucy understand the community she was becoming part of. "That's where the Peterson boys built their first cabin," Emma said, pointing to a stand of mature trees near a creek crossing. "Nothing left of it now but the foundation stones, but they lived there 3 years while they proved up their claim and built the bigger house you saw yesterday. Hard workers, all of them, and they've done well for themselves." The Clancy homestead was larger than Emma's, with extensive fields already showing rows of corn and wheat, and a substantial barn that spoke of prosperous farming. The house itself was 2 stories of whitewashed wood with a wraparound porch that spoke of both practicality and comfort. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Emma could see figures moving about the yard as they approached, the busy activity of a large family managing the endless tasks of farm life. Martha Clancy emerged from the house as their wagon pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling in welcome. She was a sturdy woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of competent manner that came from years of managing a large household and farm operation. Her apron bore the evidence of a busy day: flour from baking, soil from garden work, and what looked like preserves from the berry patch she was known to maintain. "Emma Henley. What a pleasant surprise. And this must be Lucy." Martha's voice was warm but not overwhelming, and she approached the wagon with the easy manner of someone comfortable with children. "Daniels mentioned you, dear. Said you were the smartest girl on that train, and that you helped some of the little ones with their letters." Lucy's eyes brightened at the mention of Daniel, and she looked around the farmyard with obvious interest. The Clancy place was bustling with activity: chickens pecking in the yard, a cat sunning itself on the porch steps, and the sound of hammering coming from somewhere behind the barn where repairs were apparently underway. "He's out in the back pasture with Patrick, checking on the cattle," Martha continued. "But they should be back shortly. Patrick's been teaching him to read the signs of weather in the animal's behavior, and Daniel's got a real knack for it. Won't you come in for coffee? I just pulled a cake from the oven, and it's been too long since we've had proper company." They settled in Martha's kitchen, which was larger than Emma's but had the same comfortable feel of a room designed for both work and family life. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains, and the smell of fresh cake filled the air. A spice cake, Emma realized, rich with cinnamon and nutmeg that spoke of a cook who didn't stint on precious seasonings. Lucy sat quietly but alertly, clearly listening for any sound that might indicate Daniel's return. "How's the boy settling in?" Emma asked as Martha poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been kept warm all day, and cut generous slices of cake that steamed slightly in the cool air. "Better than we hoped," Martha replied honestly, settling into her chair with the satisfied sigh of a woman taking her first real break of the day. "He's a hard worker, never complains, and he's got a quick mind for learning. Patrick's been teaching him about cattle, and Daniel's taken to it like he was born to it. Got good instincts with animals, and they seem to trust him right off. Quiet boy, though. Reminds me of Lucy here. Watches everything, says little, but you can see the wheels turning." The cake was excellent, moist and flavorful, and Emma complimented Martha on her baking. They talked of spring plans and weather prospects, the comfortable conversation of farm women who understood each other's challenges and concerns. Lucy listened intently, her eyes moving between the speakers as if she were learning not just the words but the rhythms of how neighbors talked to each other. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of boots on the front porch announced the return of Patrick Clancy and his young charge. Patrick was a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who worked with large animals. His hands bore the calluses and small scars of decades of farm work, and his face had the deep tan of someone who spent his days outdoors regardless of weather. Daniel appeared behind him, and Emma was struck by how much the boy had changed in just 3 weeks. He was still thin, but there was color in his cheeks now, and his clothes, clearly hand-me-downs from the Clancy boys, fit him properly and were clean and mended. Most importantly, there was a relaxed quality to his posture that hadn't been there on the train platform, the easy stance of someone who no longer expected trouble around every corner. "Lucy!" Daniel's face lit up with genuine pleasure when he saw her, and he crossed the kitchen in quick strides. "How are you? Are you well? Is your new home good? I've been wondering and hoping." For the first time since Emma had known her, Lucy smiled a real, unreserved smile that transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said simply, but her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Henley is kind. And there's a garden, and animals, and books. So many books. Books." Daniel's eyes brightened with the hunger of someone who valued learning above almost everything else. "I was hoping. The Clancys have been teaching me about farming, but I was worried about keeping up with reading and such. I don't want to forget what I learned." "Lucy's been helping me remember what my books say," Emma interjected gently. "She's got a fine mind for learning, reads poetry like she was born to it. Maybe she could share what she's been reading, and you could tell her about what you're learning here." What followed was the longest conversation Emma had heard from Lucy since her arrival. The two children compared experiences, sharing the careful updates of young people who'd learned not to complain but wanted to reassure each other of their safety and progress. Daniel talked about learning to milk cows and mend fences, about the horse he was being taught to ride, and the satisfaction of seeing cattle grow fat on good pasture. Lucy described the garden, and her growing familiarity with Bessie and the chickens, the quiet pleasure of tending growing things and the comfortable rhythms of homestead life. Patrick and Martha exchanged glances with Emma, all three adults recognizing the importance of this connection for both children. These were not just friends catching up, but survivors checking on each other, making sure they'd both found safe harbor in an uncertain world. "Daniel's been asking about schooling," Patrick said eventually, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee and a grateful nod toward his wife. "We've got books, and Martha's been working with him on his letters and numbers. But we're thinking when the traveling teacher comes through next month, both children might benefit from some proper lessons together." "Miss Henderson's a fine teacher," Martha added. "Comes through every few weeks during the warmer months, works with children from all the homesteads in the area. She's got a way of making learning interesting, and she's always saying how important it is for children to have others their age to work with." "That's a fine idea," Emma agreed. "Lucy's got learning well beyond her years. Might do them both good to have someone their own age to work with, and Miss Henderson's got a reputation for being able to challenge students no matter where they start." The afternoon stretched pleasantly as the adults talked and the children renewed their friendship. Daniel showed Lucy around the Clancy farm, pointing out the cattle he was learning to tend and the horse he'd been allowed to ride under careful supervision. The horse was a gentle mare named Belle, with patient eyes and the kind of steady temperament that made her perfect for teaching a city boy the basics of horsemanship. Lucy listened with the intense attention she brought to everything, asking occasional questions that showed she was following his explanations with genuine interest. When the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Emma knew it was time to head home. The evening chores wouldn't wait, and she wanted to reach her homestead before full darkness fell and made the familiar road treacherous for Daisy's careful steps. "You're welcome here any time," Martha said as they prepared to leave, embracing Emma with the warmth of genuine friendship. "Both of you. It's good for Daniel to have a friend nearby, someone who understands where he came from. And we enjoy the company more than you know." Lucy climbed into the wagon with obvious reluctance, looking back at Daniel as they pulled away. The boy stood in the farmyard waving until they were out of sight, and Lucy turned forward in her seat with a small sigh that spoke of contentment rather than sadness. "Good to see a friend?" Emma asked gently as Daisy picked up her steady pace along the familiar road. "Yes," Lucy replied. Then, after a moment of consideration, she added, "He looks happy. Stronger. The Clancys are good people, aren't they? Some of the best. They'll treat him fair and teach him skills that'll serve him well. Same as I hope to do for you." The ride home was different from the trip out. Lucy sat closer to Emma on the wagon seat, no longer poised to flee at the first sign of trouble. As Daisy picked her way carefully along the familiar road in the gathering dusk, Lucy began to talk. Not the careful, minimal responses Emma was used to, but actual conversation that flowed like water finally released from a dam. "On the train," Lucy said slowly, her voice carrying over the steady clip-clop of Daisy's hooves. "Some of the children cried every night. But Daniel never did. He would sit with the little ones and tell them stories about farms and horses and having enough to eat every day. He made them believe things would be better. Sounds like a good friend to have. He protected me too. When some of the boys were saying mean things about girls who wouldn't talk, Daniel told them to leave me be. Said I was just being careful, and careful wasn't a bad thing to be." Lucy's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the words were helping her understand something about herself. "He said some people need time to figure out if a place is safe before they can be themselves." Emma felt a surge of affection for the boy she'd only just met properly today. He was right about that. Careful's kept you safe so far. Nothing wrong with taking time to figure out who you can trust. Lucy was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Emma had been wondering if she'd ever hear. "Mrs. Henley? Why did you take me? You could have chosen any of the children. Some of them were stronger, or older, or less trouble." Emma finished gently. Lucy nodded. Emma considered her answer carefully, knowing it was important to get this right. "I reckon I saw something of myself in you, child. I was about your age when my mama died, and I learned early that sometimes the safest thing is to watch and wait before you decide to trust somebody. You reminded me of me at that age, trying to figure out if the world was going to be kind or cruel, and not willing to bet your safety on a stranger's smile. Were you right to be careful? Most times, yes. But not always. There were good people I kept at arm's length longer than I needed to, and that cost me some happiness along the way. The trick is learning to tell the difference between caution that keeps you safe and fear that keeps you lonely." Lucy absorbed this in silence as they turned into the lane leading to Emma's homestead. The familiar outline of house and barn stood dark against the evening sky, with warm yellow light glowing in the kitchen windows where Emma had left a lamp burning low on the table. As they unhitched Daisy and settled her in the barn for the night, Lucy helped with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over their weeks together. The evening chores had become a comfortable routine: feeding the chickens, checking that Bessie had fresh water, securing the barn against any predators that might venture too close during the night. "Mrs. Henley?" Lucy said as they walked toward the house, their day's work done and the comfortable tiredness of physical labor settling into their bones. "Yes. I think I'd like to learn to cook. To help with the meals and such. If you think I'm old enough." Emma smiled in the darkness. "I think you're old enough for a great many things, child. We'll start tomorrow morning. Nothing fancy to begin with, biscuits, maybe, and how to tend a fire so it burns steady without wasting wood. And maybe I could learn to read to you? In the evenings? Some of those books you said haven't been opened in too long." "I'd like that very much," Emma said, and meant it with her whole heart. The quiet evenings that had once been peaceful solitude were beginning to feel like loneliness, and the thought of Lucy's clear voice filling the silence with stories and poetry held more appeal than she'd expected. That night, as Emma banked the fire and secured the house for sleep, she reflected on the changes 3 weeks had brought. Lucy was still careful, still watchful, but the rigid tension that had held her so tightly was beginning to ease like ice melting in spring sunshine. The child was learning to trust, slowly and cautiously, but genuinely. Upstairs, Lucy sat at her bedroom window looking out at the star-filled sky. The same stars that had seemed so foreign and overwhelming on her first night now felt familiar, part of the rhythm of this new life she was tentatively beginning to embrace. Tomorrow would bring new lessons. Cooking, reading aloud, perhaps more work in the garden that was becoming as much hers as Emma's. For the first time since leaving New York, Lucy Morrison allowed herself to hope that she had found not just safety, but home. And in the room below, Emma Henley fell asleep with the same hope warming her heart, grateful for the unexpected gift of a child's trust and the promise of shared tomorrows stretching ahead like the newly planted garden, full of potential and requiring only patience, care, and time to flourish into something beautiful. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Emma and Lucy worked side by side in the garden, their sleeves rolled up and their bonnets providing precious shade against the relentless heat. It was early August, and the vegetables they'd planted with such hope in the spring had grown into a veritable feast that required constant tending. Tomato vines heavy with fruit needed staking, beans climbed their poles in verdant spirals, and the corn stood tall enough that Lucy had to stretch to reach the developing ears. Lucy had grown too, Emma reflected as she watched the child carefully examine each tomato for ripeness. Not just in height, though she'd gained several inches and filled out considerably under Emma's careful feeding, but in confidence and ease. The watchful wariness that had marked her first months on the homestead had gradually given way to something approaching genuine contentment. She spoke freely now, sharing observations about the plants and animals, asking questions about everything from weather patterns to the proper way to preserve vegetables for winter. "Mrs. Henley," Lucy said, setting down her basket of ripe tomatoes and wiping perspiration from her forehead, "there's a rider coming up the lane. Moving fast." Emma straightened and shaded her eyes against the glare. Sure enough, a lone horseman was approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than a social call. As the figure drew closer, she recognized young Tom Peterson, one of the neighbor boys who sometimes carried messages between the scattered homesteads. "Mrs. Henley," Tom called out as he reined in his lathered horse near the garden gate. "Ma sent me to fetch you quick. There's trouble at the Clancy place." Legal trouble. Emma's blood chilled. Legal trouble in their part of the territory usually meant one thing. Someone was trying to claim property that rightfully belonged to another, using dubious paperwork and corrupt officials to steal what honest families had worked years to build. "What kind of trouble?" Emma asked, already untying her apron and calculating how quickly she could hitch the wagon. "Man came to town yesterday with papers saying the Clancy homestead ain't properly filed. Claims Patrick never completed his proving up, and the land's available for auction. Sheriff's there now, and they're saying the family's got to vacate by sundown or be removed by force." Lucy had gone very still beside Emma, her face pale beneath her bonnet. The child had developed a deep affection for the Clancy family during their regular visits over the summer months, and Emma knew the thought of Daniel losing his safe harbor would be devastating to her. "That's nonsense," Emma said sharply. "Patrick Clancy proved up that claim fair and square, filed all his papers proper with the territorial office. I was there when he made his final filing." "Yes'm, but this fellow's got papers that say different. Says there was irregularities in the original filing, and he's got right to claim the land under territorial statute. Sheriff's got to uphold the law, even if he don't like it." Emma's mind raced. She'd seen this pattern before. Unscrupulous men with connections to corrupt officials would find successful homesteads and manufacture legal challenges designed to steal the land. Often they'd wait until families had spent years improving the property, making it more valuable, before moving in for the kill. "Lucy, go hitch Daisy to the wagon," Emma commanded. "Quickly now. Tom, you ride back and tell your ma to spread the word to every family within 10 miles. The Clancys need witnesses, and they need them now." As Lucy ran toward the barn with the swift efficiency she'd developed over months of farm life, Emma hurried into the house to gather what she might need. She pulled the strongbox from beneath her bed and removed the packet of papers she kept there. Land deeds, certificates, and other documents that proved the legitimacy of various claims in the area. She'd learned long ago that in frontier disputes, documentation could mean the difference between justice and theft. The ride to the Clancy homestead passed in tense silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of Daisy's hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. Lucy sat rigid beside Emma, her small hands clenched in her lap, while Emma's mind worked through possible strategies. She'd dealt with claim jumpers before, and she knew the key was often finding flaws in their supposedly legitimate paperwork. As they crested the hill that gave them their first view of the Clancy farm, Emma's heart sank. Several official-looking men stood in the farmyard, including Sheriff Morrison, a decent man caught between the law and his conscience. Near the barn, Patrick and Martha Clancy faced a well-dressed stranger who was gesturing emphatically while consulting a sheaf of papers. Daniel stood close to Martha, his face set in the careful blankness Emma recognized from his train days. Other wagons were already arriving as neighbors responded to Tom Peterson's call. Emma recognized the Washingtons from town, the elderly Reverend Thomas who served the scattered community, and several other families who'd known the Clancys for years. This was how frontier justice worked, not through corrupt courts or distant officials, but through the collective testimony of people who knew the truth. Emma pulled up near the other wagons and climbed down, her packet of papers clutched firmly in her hand. Lucy stayed close beside her, her eyes never leaving Daniel's tense figure. "What's the situation, Sheriff?" Emma called out as she approached the group. Sheriff Morrison turned with obvious relief at seeing her. Jim Morrison was a fair man trapped in an impossible position, and Emma could read the frustration in his weathered features. "Mrs. Henley. This here's Mr. Cornelius Barfield from the territorial capital. He's got papers claiming irregularities in Patrick's original homestead filing. Says the land's subject to auction for failure to complete proper proving-up procedures." Barfield was a thin, sharp-faced man in a city suit that looked out of place against the backdrop of honest farm buildings. His eyes held the calculating gleam of someone who made his living from other people's misfortune, and Emma disliked him instantly. "Mrs. Henley, is it?" Barfield's voice carried the oily smoothness of a confidence man. "I understand you're something of a local authority on land matters. Perhaps you can help these good people understand that the law must be followed, regardless of sentiment." "I understand the law just fine," Emma replied coolly. "What I don't understand is how Patrick Clancy's filing could be irregular when I witnessed him complete every requirement. Filed his initial claim in 1847, proved up his improvements in 1850, and received his final certificate in 1851. All proper and legal." Barfield consulted his papers with theatrical precision. "Ah, but you see, there's the problem. According to territorial records, Mr. Clancy's initial filing was never properly witnessed. The signature on the witness line appears to be forged." A murmur of outrage rippled through the gathered neighbors. Emma felt her anger building but forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of manufactured technicality these land thieves used. Create doubt about some minor procedural detail from years past, then claim the entire homestead as forfeit. "That's impossible," declared Reverend Thomas, stepping forward with the moral authority his position commanded. "I was there when Patrick made his filing. Signed as witness myself, along with Dr. Morrison and Samuel Peterson. All of us can testify to the legitimacy of that claim." "Ah, Reverend," Barfield said with mock sympathy, "but signatures can be disputed, memories can fade. What matters is what the official records show, and I'm afraid they show clear evidence of fraud." Emma studied the man carefully, noting the expensive cut of his clothes, the soft hands that had never held a plow, the calculating way his eyes assessed the prosperous farm around them. This wasn't about legal technicalities, this was about money. Someone had identified the Clancy homestead as valuable and was using legal manipulation to steal it. "May I see these records?" Emma asked politely. Barfield hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Emma to know she was on the right track. "I'm afraid these are official territorial documents. Not for casual examination." "Nothing casual about it," Emma replied firmly. "If you're going to destroy a family based on those papers, the least you can do is let someone who knows the filing procedures examine them." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "She's got a point, Barfield. Mrs. Henley here helped establish half the homesteads in this county. If anyone can spot irregularities in filing procedures, it's her." Reluctantly, Barfield produced a leather portfolio and withdrew a document. Emma examined it carefully, her eyes scanning every line while her mind catalogued inconsistencies. The paper was wrong. Too white, too crisp for something supposedly filed years earlier. The ink was wrong too, a slightly different shade than the territorial office had used in 1847. Most tellingly, the clerk's seal was incorrect. She remembered the original seal had been damaged and replaced in 1849, but this document bore the old seal design. "This is a forgery," Emma announced quietly. Barfield's face flushed. "That's a serious accusation, madam. Are you suggesting that territorial officials—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Emma interrupted. "I'm stating a fact. This document is false. The paper's too new, the ink's wrong, and the seal wasn't in use when this filing was supposedly made. Someone's gone to considerable trouble to manufacture evidence against the Clancys." The gathered neighbors began murmuring among themselves, their voices rising in anger. Lucy had moved closer to Daniel, and Emma saw the boy's shoulders straighten as hope flickered in his eyes. "Furthermore," Emma continued, opening her own packet of papers, "I have here a copy of Patrick's original filing, signed by the witnesses and properly sealed. I keep copies of important documents for my neighbors, knowing how easily original papers can be lost or misplaced." She handed the document to Sheriff Morrison, who examined it carefully. His face cleared as he recognized the genuine article: proper paper, correct ink, the right seal, and signatures he could verify with the living witnesses standing around them. "This appears to be legitimate," the sheriff said slowly. "And if Mrs. Henley's right about that other document being forged—" Barfield had gone very still, his calculating eyes now showing the first signs of real concern. "Sheriff, surely you can't take the word of these simple farm folk over official territorial records." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. The simple farm folk he'd just insulted included some of the most respected members of the community. People who'd built this corner of the territory with their own hands and had reputations for absolute honesty. Reverend Thomas stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of absolute moral conviction. "Mr. Barfield, I've known these people for years. I've seen them work and struggle and sacrifice to build something good from empty prairie. If Emma Henley says that document is forged, then it's forged. Her word is worth more than a cartload of your city papers." A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled neighbors. Emma looked around at the faces surrounding them, weathered, honest faces of people who'd learned to depend on each other for survival. This was frontier justice at its finest, not the corruption of distant courts but the collective wisdom of a community protecting its own. "Sheriff," Emma said firmly, "I suggest you examine Mr. Barfield's credentials as carefully as you've examined his papers. I'd be interested to know exactly who gave him authority to challenge legitimate claims." Sheriff Morrison nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I intend to do. Mr. Barfield, I'm going to need you to accompany me back to town for some questions about these documents." Barfield's composure finally cracked. "You can't be serious. I have every legal right." "You have the right to explain to a judge how you came by forged territorial documents," the sheriff interrupted. "And you'll have that opportunity real soon. As Sheriff Morrison led the sputtering Barfield away, the tension in the farmyard began to dissolve. Patrick Clancy stood with his arm around Martha's shoulders, relief evident in every line of their faces. Daniel had moved to stand with Lucy, and Emma saw the children clasp hands briefly, a gesture of mutual support that spoke to the bond they'd maintained throughout the summer. "Emma," Patrick said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't kept those copies." "Neighbors look out for neighbors," Emma replied simply. "That's how we survive out here. Besides, I had my own reasons for making sure Barfield didn't succeed." She looked toward Lucy and Daniel, who were now talking quietly near the barn. "Some things are worth protecting, no matter what it costs." As the other neighbors began to disperse, assured that the crisis had passed, Martha approached Emma with tears in her eyes. "You saved our home. Our family. I'll never forget this." "Just remember it when someone else needs help," Emma said. "That's how community works. We all take turns being strong for each other." The ride home was different from the tense journey earlier that day. Lucy sat close beside Emma, no longer rigid with fear but relaxed in the way that came after danger had passed. The late afternoon sun slanted golden across the prairie, and the familiar rhythm of Daisy's hooves created a peaceful backdrop for conversation. "Mrs. Henley," Lucy said eventually, "how did you know those papers were false?" Emma smiled at the child's curiosity. Over the months, Lucy had developed an endless appetite for understanding how the adult world worked, particularly the mechanisms that protected or threatened the security she'd found so precious. "Experience, mostly. I've seen enough official documents to know what they should look like. And I learned long ago that when something seems too convenient for someone who stands to profit, it's worth examining real careful." "Will there be more men like Mr. Barfield? Trying to take people's homes?" Emma considered her answer carefully. "Maybe. There's always been folks who'd rather steal than work for what they want. But there's more good people than bad ones, and when good people stand together, the bad ones usually lose." Lucy nodded thoughtfully. "Like today. Everyone came to help the Clancys." "That's right. That's what community means, knowing you don't have to face trouble alone." As they turned into their own lane, Emma felt a deep satisfaction settling over her. The garden waited for them, heavy with the promise of harvest. The house stood ready to welcome them home. And beside her sat a child who'd grown from frightened refugee to confident young woman, someone who understood both the value of careful self-protection and the importance of standing up for others when the need arose. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Lucy broke the comfortable silence with a question that had clearly been building all day. "Mrs. Henley, what if someone tried to take our home? Like they tried to take the Clancys?" Emma set down her mending and looked at the child seriously. "Then we'd fight for it. Just like we fought for the Clancys today. This place belongs to us, not because papers say so, though they do, but because we've put our lives into making it home." "And people would help us? Like they helped today?" "Yes," Emma said without hesitation. "You're part of this community now, Lucy. These are your neighbors, your people. They'd stand for you just like you'd stand for them." Lucy smiled, the kind of deep, peaceful smile that came from genuine security. "I never had that before. People who would fight for me." "Well, you do now," Emma replied firmly. "And you always will, as long as there's breath in my body." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Emma reflected on the day's events and their larger meaning. Lucy had come to her as a frightened child, uncertain of her place in the world and wary of trusting anyone with her safety. Today, she'd seen that child stand with courage beside a friend in danger, part of a community that valued justice over profit and loyalty over convenience. The transformation was complete, Emma realized. Lucy Morrison was no longer the silent, watchful refugee from the orphan train. She'd become Lucy Henley, not in name perhaps, but in every way that mattered. She belonged here, rooted as firmly in this prairie soil as the corn in their garden. Inside the house, the lamp cast warm light over the simple furniture that had become so familiar to Lucy over the months. Her books lined the shelf beside Emma's, their spines creating a timeline of shared reading and growing literacy. The kitchen held the comfortable disorder of two people working together to preserve the summer's abundance. Jars of preserves cooling on the counter, vegetables laid out for tomorrow's canning, the ongoing cycle of harvest and preservation that would see them through another winter. "Mrs. Henley," Lucy said as they prepared for bed, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, child?" Would it be proper for me to call you something other than Mrs. Henley? I mean, if you wouldn't mind." Emma felt her heart expand with warmth. "What did you have in mind?" Lucy hesitated, then spoke with the careful courage of someone venturing into new territory. "Maybe, Aunt Emma, if that would be all right. I know I'm not really family, but—" "You're as much family as blood could make you," Emma interrupted gently. "More, maybe because we chose each other. Aunt Emma sounds just fine to me." That night, Emma lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of her homestead settling into sleep. The soft murmur of wind through the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the comfortable creaking of wood that had weathered many seasons. But now there was something new in the nighttime symphony. The quiet breathing of a child who slept without fear, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. Lucy Morrison had arrived on the Orphan train as a refugee from circumstances beyond her control, carrying nothing but a small bundle and an enormous capacity for caution. She'd refused to be chosen that day on the platform, determined to make her own decision about where and with whom she'd place her trust. In the end, Emma reflected with deep satisfaction, Lucy had chosen well. They both had. The frightened child had found not just shelter but home, not just safety but family. And Emma Henley, who'd spent so many years in careful solitude, had discovered that the greatest joy came not from protecting herself from the uncertainties of caring for another, but from opening her heart wide enough to include someone else's dreams and fears alongside her own. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song of endurance and hope, carrying the promise of another season of growth, another harvest, another winter survived together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and satisfactions, but tonight there was peace in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. Aunt and niece by choice, family by love, rooted forever in this corner of the vast frontier that had become, at last, home.